I heard this story from my friend. Apparently it's something that happens often at hospitals. Two nurses were walking down a hall. It was lunchtime. An old woman, one of the inpatients, came walking towards them and said hello. The nurses said hello back. After the old woman had passed them, one of the nurses turned to the other and said, "Don't turn around. That woman died yesterday." It seemed the old woman hadn't realized she was dead yet. When people think of ghosts, they mostly think of them as being transparent spirits, but there are some that still look exactly the same as they did when alive. Another time, a patient was walking towards some nurses and smiled and said hello. The head nurse sent the others off to do various chores or pulled them aside to chat, so no one was looking in the patient's direction. One of them wondered why, and it turned out the patient had also died the day before. Apparently it's not uncommon for spirits to walk down the hospital halls, not just at night, but during the day as well. They approach nurses to talk and apparently jump on their backs unaware as well. Hearing that, and knowing that nurses continue to work so hard at an already difficult job, made me respect them even more. Hey guys, I'm your host Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to another episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. A big thank you to everyone who has picked up their copy of Kaihan, Bizarre Crimes That Shook Japan so far, and another big thank you to everyone who has left a rating or review as well. To celebrate, this week, and this week only, you can grab the book on sale in the US and UK Amazon stores for just 99 cents. This is for 1 week only, so don't miss out. You can find the link in the episode description on kowabana.net, or just type in Kaihan on Amazon right now and pick up your copy. On this week's episode, we're going to be delving into the horror lurking in Japanese hospitals. These are the stories of patients, doctors, nurses, and other workers who have experienced something terrifying while in supposedly safe walls. Our first story for this week features a nurse recollecting a series of strange events that have happened to her and other nurses she knows. She can't explain them, but even now, they still terrify her. This one's called Hospital Story. I've been working as a nurse for a long time now. I've worked at several hospitals, so let me share with you a few scary stories. When I was working in surgery, I heard lots of stories about patients who, just before they died, reported that their dead parents had come to visit them. The other nurses always thought it was a joke, but it happened so often that they started to doubt it. Maybe their parents really did come to pick them up. That's how I've started to feel about it recently, anyway. If you go to visit someone and they mention their dead parents are standing nearby, please don't refute them. There's a good chance that they really do see them. Once I started working the night shift, I could no longer watch scary television programs at night. I had to make my rounds by myself, so if I watched them, I'd be too scared to. Still, when you work in a hospital, you naturally hear all sorts of scary stories. There was one patient I heard about who was in his 60s or 70s. He had a serious injury and was unable to move around. He spent most of his time sleeping, and the nurses did everything for him. But one day, a nurse on her way in to work for the morning found him hanging from a tree outside. He couldn't walk, so it was very strange. Then there's also this story. Two nurses were working alone in a hospital ward. All the patients were asleep. One nurse stayed in the nurses' station, while the other took a nap. There were no families visiting the patients, so the only sound was that of the monitor in the nurse's station. Then there was a knock at the nap room. The other nurse was most definitely back in the nurse's station at the time. Even now, they still don't know who it was. Another nurse I knew was working in the psych ward when this happened. Because it was the psych ward, the nurse's station was locked at night. A patient came over complaining that they wanted some sleeping pills because they couldn't sleep. And for some reason, just for that night, patient after patient came to visit the nurse's station. For some reason, the nurse found herself drowsy and unable to move. I gotta move, she told herself. Then something suddenly slapped her on the shoulders. Get it together! She came back too, and when she did, all the patients were gone. She was tired, so she thought that maybe she had been dreaming, but she could still feel the impact of the hit on her shoulders. The door was still locked, and she was alone. I think I've also seen something strange before too. I was working the night shift with another nurse, and when we were walking down the hall, somebody quickly brushed past us. The other nurse felt it as well, and we turned around to see who it might be walking around so late at night. But nobody was there. But the event that sticks out most in my mind was when I was in an elevator with the family of a patient who had just passed away. We got on the elevator and went to the first floor where the door opened. Nobody got on or off, and yet the elevator announced, "Could the last person please step out of the elevator?" I'll say this again. Nobody got on or off. Not only that, it was the first time I'd ever heard any sort of announcement on the elevator like that. I told the other staff about it, but nobody believed me. They told me it must have been a malfunction, and they tried it for themselves, but the announcement never played again. It's a little sad that nobody believed me, but then again, maybe I was just hearing things. The nurse in this next story works in the old wing of a hospital currently being renovated. She deals with a lot of elderly patients suffering from dementia, meaning she hears a lot of stories about things that just can't be. But there's one room in particular that, regardless of the patient, they all complain about the same thing. Is something haunting that particular room? Find out in Delirious Hallucinations at Night. This happened when I worked for a certain hospital about 2 or 3 years ago. This hospital had several new buildings built, and they all connected to the old building. At the time, I worked in the oldest of those wards. All sorts of patients came in, but the most common was the elderly. They came in for all sorts of reasons. Broken bones after slipping, strokes, etc., etc. But either way, the beds were full of the elderly. Have you ever heard of night delirium? To put it simply, your consciousness becomes vague at night and you hallucinate things. It's common with dementia patients, but each person suffers from it differently. With some people, it might only happen when they're in poor health. This is how it was at the hospital I worked at. Of course, there were also lots of patients with dementia as well. And so, there were numerous patients who suffered from delusions at night. Hey! Hey! Someone! I knew somebody was calling out, but the echo of the voice down the dim hall frightened me. Usually at times like this, someone was suffering from hallucinations, and That itself was also frightening. The patients often screamed, "There's somebody there," or "What's that black thing?" They complained about something only they could see. Even when you told them it was a hallucination, they would insist something was there. It was scary. The human brain truly is strange, seeing things that don't actually exist. One time, an old woman stumbled out of her room. "What's wrong?" I asked, and she said, her voice emotionless, "There are floating heads outside my window." She showed no emotional change. Normally, if you saw something like that, you'd panic, but she carried on like always. Maybe if there was a graveyard outside the window, it would add a little snap to the story, but unfortunately, there wasn't. It was just a normal residential area. Nervous, I went back with her to check the window, but there was, of course, nothing there. Normally, with a case like this, we'd chalk it up to hallucinations. But there was one room in particular where these hallucinations were a little different to the others. Those who stayed in the room all suffered from a variety of ailments. There were some with dementia, and then even those patients who didn't have it also saw things. And what they saw was a woman suddenly standing near the door. We often heard from people staying in the room, "I couldn't see very well, but who was it that came to my room last night?" So many people saw the same thing that it couldn't have been a hallucination. It had to be the real thing. I asked one of the senior nurses about why people from that same room reported seeing the same thing, but nobody knew why. This hospital is old, and numerous people have died in these rooms. I have no idea why, she said. Then she continued, "Come to think of it, I'm pretty sure I've seen her before myself as well." "So, she's real?" I said before I could stop myself. "And you saw her? Tell me all about it." It's not like she does anything, and she doesn't impede my work, so," she replied, just like the reliable veteran she was. After hearing that, I grew scared of walking the halls at night, but in the end, I don't have the ability to see ghosts, so I never saw anything anyway. I came to understand what the senior nurse meant by "she doesn't impede with my work," and it scared me a little that she was so used to it. In the end, the building was so old that it too was eventually knocked down and rebuilt. After that, we never heard anything about that woman from the patients again. Come to think of it, I haven't heard any stories about that woman recently, I mentioned to my senior colleague one day, trying to touch on the topic again. "Yeah, same. Because she's not in that room anymore," she said. She wouldn't tell me where she was now, but it seems she's moved somewhere out of sight. The woman in this next story is not a nurse, but a new mother. She's also able to see ghosts, and on her first night in the hospital after the birth of her daughter, something terrifying approaches her. And although it's the first time, turns out it won't be the last either. Find out what happens in Same Hospital, Same Room. This all happened when I was just 20. I had a strong ability to see ghosts at the time, and a lot of people relied on me for things. And by things, I mean people often came to me and asked me to do something for them when it came to the supernatural. It wasn't like I was constantly seeing ghosts all the time, but like a local monk once said, it was kinda like every now and then I'd see something rush by. So, at this particularly emotional time, I also got married and gave birth. It was a so-called shotgun wedding, you might say. It was a particularly emotional birth, with my family worried about me raising the child and living with my partner's family. And when I get emotional, I tend to see things. Ghostly things. I was able to grit my teeth through the pain and finally gave birth. Once the after treatment was over, I fell asleep. They took the baby to the newborn's room. I went to see my adorable new child numerous times. My time in the maternity ward passed blissfully, like anybody else's. At the hospital I was staying in, mother and child didn't spend their first night together in the same room, meaning that first night I was alone. I was exhausted from the birth, but even so, I kept waking up. It went like this all night, on and on. I wonder what time it was. My eyes suddenly flung open again. Unable to sleep, I decided to go see how my baby was doing. She was sleeping soundly. So cute. I walked down the dark hall back to my room alone, feeling happy. I could hear the cries of babies from other rooms, but they all just sounded lovely to me, and I opened the door to my room. It smelt vaguely of milk, and I got back into bed. I lay on my side and faced the wall. I felt something cold on my back, like it was going to freeze. Go away! Go away! I desperately screamed internally, but it was no good. My hips felt cold, but heavy. Shit, I thought, and rolled over onto my back. A spirit was trying to possess me. At this rate, it would hijack my body. But I couldn't think of any way to fight back. I just trembled in fear. Next, I felt myself being dragged, and when I opened my eyes and turned to the side, I locked eyes with a long-haired woman. Give it back. Give it back. Give me back my child, she muttered, trying to possess me. At that moment, I remembered the Buddhist chant my mother had taught me. I prayed over and over. I don't know anything about your child. I have nothing to give you, so go away. As the sun started to rise outside, the woman finally disappeared. Finally, I could sleep. I didn't see or sense her again. 3 years later, I was blessed with another child. I ended up in the same room as my first. On the first night, again, that woman appeared. Only this time, she jumped on top of me and started squeezing my neck. Give it back. Give it back. Give me back my child. I spoke the same chant as when I gave birth to my eldest daughter and prayed. I don't know anything about your child. I have nothing to give you, so go away. But perhaps her malice had grown, because this time she wouldn't leave. Finally, as morning came, she disappeared, and I didn't see her again for the rest of my stay. I later discovered that a friend of my younger sister worked as a nurse at that hospital, so I asked her about it. It turned out that several years earlier, a mother and child had died there. Up until the birth, everything had proceeded well, and there were no worries. But things quickly went south during the delivery, The emergency transport wasn't quick enough, and the mother and child both died in separate locations. It seemed the spirit of the mother had shown herself to me. It's 3 years later now, and I'm about to give birth to my third child. I can't help but feel like I'm going to end up in that exact same room again. It's not a massive hospital, but there are more than 15 rooms. My delivery date is fast approaching, and on top of the joy of meeting this brand new life, there's also fear and anxiety of running into that woman again. The man in this next story works as a night watchman for a small clinic. With little to do other than monitoring an empty building, he's allowed all the freedom to do as he pleases and get paid for it. It's a dream job. Until one night when the alarm lights flicker on, even though no one else is in the building. But, as it turns out, something is. Find out what in Night Watch at the Clinic. Several years ago, one of my senior classmates at university introduced me to a small medical clinic where I got a part-time job as a night watchman. My duties included patrolling one time and handling the phone. Other than that, I was free to do whatever I wanted, so it was a dream job. The clinic was a 3-story building. The first floor held reception, the waiting room, and various examining rooms. The second floor was made up of offices, meeting rooms, and a kitchen. And the third floor was the night duty room. The night duty room was a Japanese-style room with a sliding door and one set of stairs. Although it was a small clinic, they handled patients' medical records, so they were guarded by a nationwide security firm. The night watch generally went as follows. I'd arrive at the clinic at 9 p.m, enter through the back door, the front locked at 7:30, and unlock the security mode. I'd patrol the building and then enter the night duty room on the 3rd floor. There was also a control panel up there, so once I went in, I'd again set it to security mode. Security sensors were placed pretty much all over the 1st and 2nd floors, but because there weren't any in the night duty room, I could move around freely. The control panel had lights, and as long as everything was fine, the lights would be green. If the sensors were triggered, then the lights would turn red, and it was my responsibility to contact the head security chief back at the firm. A warning would then ring out, informing that the doors and windows were all locked. Other than that, as long as there were no phone calls, I could do whatever I wanted. And even then, there was only perhaps one phone call a year. So I could watch TV, study, or do whatever it was that I wanted. One night, I carried out my patrol as usual, entered the night duty room, put the building back into security mode, and then kicked back. I watched TV, ate some food I'd bought at the convenience store, read a book, and then started to doze. The broadcast on TV ended and a commercial for Saturday Night True Ball began. At that moment, I glanced over at the control panel and could barely believe my eyes. The lights were red. I'd never once seen them red up until that point. Huh? Why? I thought. But as I was looking at it, the red lights turned green. Thinking about it rationally, there was no way anyone could be inside the building. If the security chief or any of the doctors were in the building, they'd have to turn off the security mode at the back entrance. And if anyone entered through the windows or doors, the moment they did, the alarms would ring. It had to be broken That was what I decided. Supposing there really was a red light, then the head office would call. But there was nothing. And if there was no phone call, then that meant it had to be broken. But even so, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the panel. Reassuringly, the green lights continued to glow. But then the very next moment, I froze again. The lights turned red once more. This time, they didn't disappear. Someone, or something, was in the clinic. All I could think was that something I didn't understand was making its way up towards me in the third-floor night duty room. I panicked and grabbed my phone, calling the head office. After a few rings, the chief picked up. "What's wrong?" The lights have turned red." "Really? We haven't got anything about that here." "But they're still on. They disappeared before, but this time they're still red." "Okay. Well, we'll confirm what's going on, so please wait. We'll call you back." Hearing his voice calmed me somewhat, but the lights continued to shine red, and I was unable to get rid of the fear taking over me. 2 minutes later, the chief called back. "We checked, and the head office hasn't received any news of irregularities." "No way! I mean, the lights are red, right now. What should I do?" "All right. If they're broken, then we need someone to come out and take a look, so I'll head over now. Wait for me." What a reliable chief. I was deeply grateful. The red lights continued to shine, but I couldn't hear anything, and I didn't sense anything either, so I calmed down a little. Although I chided myself for calling the chief out if it really was just a broken light. I mean, if that was the case, why was I even here? I laughed. Before long, I heard a car outside and footsteps downstairs walking towards the clinic. I couldn't see either the front or back door from the third floor, but I could see the path leading to the back door from the front. When I looked down, I saw the chief with a bright light heading towards the back. I followed him until he disappeared from sight, and then a few seconds later, there was a beep and the security system went off. The chief had turned it off downstairs. I wanted to meet up with him as fast as possible, so I flung open the sliding door to run downstairs. The moment I did, I immediately felt something wrong. Something smelt raw. It was an indescribable, disgusting smell. Fear took over once more, but I had just seen the chief coming my way, which meant that he was undoubtedly on the first floor. So I turned the hall lights on and ran for the stairs. The stairs in the clinic were set up so that they had a landing, and you could look from the third floor all the way down to the first. I ran to the top and looked down. The lights on the first floor weren't yet on, but the lights from the third floor cast a dim light all the way down. The smell got even stronger. The light switch for the first floor was right by the back door. So why hadn't the chief turned them on? Hurry up! Turn them on! Show yourself! Just as the smell got even worse, I suddenly heard a noise coming from the first floor. A voice? It sounded somewhat like a groan, a song, a chant, or something like that. That decided it. Whatever was on the first floor, it wasn't the chief. Confused, I broke out into a cold sweat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the first floor. The smell worsened, and the moaning grew louder. Whatever it was definitely coming towards the stairs. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. Inside, I screamed and ordered myself to run, but my body refused to move. Then it appeared. Something pale and skin-colored, almost white, and about 2 meters tall. It had no hair, and its legs were abnormally long. It moved as though dancing, all of its joints moving and swaying. It groaned, and when it reached the bottom of the stairs, it began to climb. It's coming this way. I've got to run. I've got to get out of here, I thought, but my body wouldn't move. As it reached halfway between the first and second floors, my phone in the night duty room rang. Shit, I thought, but it was too late. For a moment it stopped moving, and then all of its joints shifted and turned, and its entire body moved to face me. Our eyes met. I could see its cloudy eyeballs moving around. It opened its mouth wide and laughed a sharp, piercing sound. The next moment, while still looking at me, it ran up the stairs with incredible speed. I ran like a bullet, but I had nowhere to go. I ran back to the night duty room and closed the sliding door, keeping myself pressed against it. Before long, I heard groaning coming from the stairs and an intensely raw smell. It's here! It's here! I pushed against the door, crying. I felt like I was going mad. I could hear it groaning on the other side of the door. Something hit the top of the door. All I could see in my head was that thing headbutting the door on the other side with its smooth head. This time it was around hip height. Its knees. Stop it! I screamed, although I was mostly sobbing. Then the banging stopped. So did the groaning. I dropped down and backed away from the door, keeping my eyes on it. Once I reached the other wall, I pushed myself up to my feet. There was a window. The banging had stopped, and so had the groaning, but that thing was right on the other side of the door. I knew it. That smell from before still hadn't abated. For some reason, I knew that the next impact would be the one where it finally broke through the door. I glared at it, my hands reaching to open the window behind me. As I heard the door being torn open, I threw myself out the window. As I fell, I looked up at the room for just a second, and I saw its mouth open wide, right in front of my nose. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Both my arms and legs were broken, and I had a fracture in my skull. Apparently, I'd been on the verge of death. My family were overjoyed I was awake, but I noticed the nurse's attitude towards me was a little strange. Almost like she was afraid of me. As my injuries healed, they moved me to a different hospital, and as I was leaving, I decided to ask the nurse why she was acting like she was. "Because you've been injured all this time," she said. "But when night falls, you open your eyes and open your mouth, and it's like you start singing or chanting, almost like groaning." No matter how friendly a couple may appear to the outside world, you never truly can tell what's going on behind the scenes. The couple in this next story are both doctors working at a general hospital, and they see all sorts of things. But one case in particular leaves them scratching their heads. This one's called The Friendly Couple. My husband and I both work at the same hospital. It's a general hospital, so we see all sorts of patients. We sometimes deal with difficult patients and their families, but I'm proud to work in a place that deals with human lives, and I work every single day. This is a story that happened at that hospital. One day, my husband got home from work late with a difficult expression on his face. It wasn't his usual tired expression, nor was it the look he gets after a long but successful operation. It was kind of like something was stuck in his back teeth. An indescribable expression. When I asked him what was wrong, he gave a small sigh and started speaking. My husband is a brain surgeon who deals with emergency cases. A patient's information is private, so in general, we're not allowed to speak to anyone else about it. But I work at the same hospital, so he started telling me about the patient who came in that day. The man had been working on a stepladder when he slipped and hit his head, knocking him unconscious. But the doctors who examined him found his injuries strange. After falling from a stepladder, he shouldn't have been in such a state, they thought. It would have been best to ask the man directly what happened and how he fell, but he was unconscious. So, they decided to speak to his family. His wife had ridden with him in the ambulance, but she was deaf, and nobody in the hospital at the time spoke sign language. They called the couple's son, who then arrived shortly thereafter to translate. According to the son, his parents got along extremely well and were also well regarded within their neighborhood. He was an old-fashioned man, although a little stubborn. His wife was a demure woman, the type who would walk 3 steps behind him at all times. Even at the hospital, she didn't wish to be away from her husband for a second, so she caused quite a fuss when they tried to get her to leave. The son continued. At the time of the accident, the only people home were his parents. His mother was working in the kitchen when she heard a bang coming from the other room. She rushed over to see what it was and saw her husband lying unconscious on the ground. She panicked and tapped him to see if he would wake up, then contacted her son to call an ambulance when he didn't. He had already fallen by the time she found him, so they still had no idea how he could have fallen. The stepladder only allowed him to reach roughly the same height as a large bookshelf, so perhaps he was reaching up to grab a book from the top at the time, but he accidentally slipped and fell. But looking at his injuries, they weren't the type of injuries that would be caused by a fall like that, my husband said, nodding before he continued. Why did they even call the son to the hospital? And how did the man's wife hear him fall? Despite their best efforts, the man died a few days later, and they were never able to find out the truth. Our final story for this week features another new mother transferred to a smaller clinic due to a lack of beds at her current hospital. But once there, she spies something outside her window that shouldn't be. Find out what in The Clinic Where Something Happened. Late one autumn, I gave birth to my first child. Unfortunately, the hospital didn't have any open beds for me, so I was taken straight from maternity to a clinic in the next city over. Of course, I didn't have to pay for the difference myself. After the birth, I was feeling rather absent-minded, so I agreed without protest, and they put me into the shaky ambulance and moved me to the clinic. It was the first time I'd ever been there, but it was extremely quiet. It was a small, very laid-back countryside town, and the clinic could be found in the mountain to the rear. Chestnut trees grew everywhere, and even in the clinic's garden, you could find chestnuts all over. They moved me to a small private room on the first floor. From my position on the bed, I could see all of the chestnut trees outside my window. I had nothing else to do, so I stared mindlessly at them. Then something suddenly moved out of the corner of my eye. It was a round, fat, reddish-brown squirrel. I smiled before I could stop myself. Maybe it was a good thing they moved me to this quiet place after all. The clinic was considerably more expensive than any other hospitals around. Compared to where I gave birth, it was a lot more expensive. The meals were exquisite, and the facilities brand new and hygienic. All of the staff were calm and kind as well. It was a little far from home, so my parents were unable to come see me, but my husband came to see me and the baby every single day. "Ah, there's someone outside your window," my husband said one day. "You mean a squirrel? It probably lives in one of the chestnut trees. I've seen it too," I said. "No, it looked much bigger, like a child," he said, and tilted his head. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But when I finished breakfast the following morning, I saw the same thing. It was a cute, chubby little girl. She must have only been around 2 years old. She ran circles around the chestnut trees. I dragged myself over to the window, still sore from the birth. But once I got there, the little girl was gone. Maybe she was a local and was playing nearby, although it was a little early for that. Strange, I thought. I started regaining my strength, but the baby wasn't doing too well, so just in case, they decided to keep both of us at the clinic for a little while longer. Staying longer at the clinic meant that I had nothing to do, and I was bored. All I could do was look out the window and watch for things that moved. Usually, it was just a squirrel, but I also saw that little girl several times as well. The windows didn't open, so I was unable to talk to her. I was a little concerned about whether her parents were worried about her or not. The baby's health improved, and we were cleared to go home just a few short days later. But when I was feeding him that night, I felt something strange. Was something watching me? I could feel someone looking at me. The only people in the room were myself and the baby. The window was covered by a thick curtain. Strange, I thought. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Finally, it was time for us to leave. I finished filling out all the forms and said my goodbyes to one of the nurses I had gotten familiar with. I also took the opportunity to ask her something. "There's a small girl that comes into the garden early in the mornings. Is she a local child?" The nurse's smiling face instantly dropped. "Yes, that's right. She's a local," she said. Just before I was about to leave, I realized I'd left my shoes under the bed. I left the baby with my husband in the parking lot and returned to my room to get them. She appeared in that room again. She wasn't born here, so I thought things would be fine, but it seems they're not. Looks like she just can't forget her mother and is still looking for her. I only heard bits and pieces of the sad story, and I didn't have the courage to ask for more details. I grabbed my shoes and hurried out of the clinic back to the car. I wonder just what happened at that clinic. If you're looking for even more Japanese horror, check out our Patreon and get access to over 70 exclusive bonus episodes right now. You can find that at patreon.com/TaraADevlin. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Kowabana Japan for more exclusive daily content, including games that have never been translated into English before, internet mysteries, bizarre crimes, and much more. Thanks guys, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.